So I want to talk to you about hyperspectral imaging, and I'm not going to give you a physics lecture. You say thank goodness for that, but what I want to do is show you an example of how it can be used in real life at scale and at speed that can make a significant difference to our farming systems. Now, I now work for PlantTech, and you might say, why has Ian left the university and gone to PlantTech? And the reason really is around data science. I believe that we need to put data science first and foremost, that for too many years we've probably been a scientific community and then we've paid lip service to data science. I think data science has now come of an age that we really need to address a lot of the problems through data science rather than, if you like, engineering. So I want to talk to you about vision, about imaging, and we all use vision, or most of us are fortunate enough to use vision to collect most of our information. So you're looking at me, seeing this image. I'm trying to look through the lights to you to distinguish different features of the audience. So we use vision a great deal. I want to discuss that just a little bit to start with. So the work that I'm going to do in terms of an example is stuff that I've done when I was working at Massey University in cooperation with Ravensdown. So that's the example that I want to really show you. So vision. We can see a certain part of the spectrum. We call it the visible because it's visible to us. Here's an example from a horse. And other herbivores have a similar, more limited version of the visible spectrum. So we can see red, green, blue. They can mainly see blue and green. So you can see what we would see and what a horse might see. It's advantageous to sometimes be able to see color. As you can see in this example where we have a tiger wandering through some bush. But before we get too sort of smug about what we can see and we realize how heavily reliant we are on our vision systems, we need to understand that there are actually instruments that can observe other parts of the spectrum and can give us a great deal of more information. So RGB, red, green, blue, is the part of the spectrum that we can see. What I've done here is, this is reflectance. The graph shows reflectance against the wavelength, and you can see that there's actually quite a small proportion of the wavelengths that we can see. As I say, we use that on a daily basis. We could use multispectral instrumentation, and that really uses the infrared, the near-infrared area. And the types of applications we can use for that are things like satellites and using drones, sensors on drones, etc. The advantage of that is that it can tell us a lot about vegetation. The reflectance is much higher in the near-infrared, and we can gain a lot of things through either using indices or other ratios of the light at the different parts of the spectrum to give us information. So you can see that we can develop that, and that's useful, and we can use it in satellites, drones, etc. But the thing that I really want to talk to you about is the power of something called hyperspectral imaging. And hyperspectral imaging is a bit different. So not only does it have a far wider range, it goes from the visible, the near-infrared, to the shortwave infrared. It also creates a profile. It's not just about discrete measurements along that part of the spectrum. It actually creates a profile. And what we can do through data science is we can interpret those signatures in order to gain a lot more information from the sensor. So these are pretty powerful sensors, and I'll describe those in a second. But we use those mainly in aircraft. The reason we do that is because we want to scale up what we're measuring. We need to get over large areas quickly. So just to put three of them together so that you understand, it's about range, it's also about the number of measurements that we can carry out. So how do we do it at scale? So here's a diagram showing how we would survey a large area of land. We would do this typically, the swath width, the width of the camera is about 500 meters. We overlap, so it's effectively 350 meters. We're going at around 160 to 200 kilometers an hour. So you can understand that we're actually collecting a great deal of information very quickly. Now you could work it out. Each square meter has one of those profiles that I described, the hyperspectral profile. So there's a lot of information going into the camera system, and you can understand, just how much information is actually being gathered. Now this camera originally used for military purposes. So a lot of this technology has come out of military developments and are now being used for civil use. So the first step is image capture. We actually have an operator in the plane that needs to be there to operate the camera. You can see the flight plan. We fly back and forward over a farm, and we collect strips of data. So the next thing we do is, you've probably heard of a technique called mosaicing, where we put those strips together, and we create, if you like, one large map of whatever the object is that we're looking at. So what are we trying to do with this camera system? So we have what we call derived products. And so it might be things like classification. Classification means I'm trying to tell the difference between different things. So it could be types of trees. It could be even cultivars of grass. We can tell the difference between different cultivars, for example. So we can get a lot of very detailed information about an environment, incredible level of detail from one pass. So the other thing we can do is quantify. We can quantify the nutrients in a plant, for example. We can understand the level of nitrogen, of phosphate, of other nutrients. So just as those of you who might live and work on a dairy farm see, a dark urine patch, because in the red, green, blue, we can pick up these differences. In a similar way, there are other chemical signatures in other parts of the spectrum that these cameras can pick up on. So we're trying to use that technology to gain information that's useful for our farming systems. The one other reason that we want to use this is in terms of prediction. We all have great hindsight, but we want to use these for foresight, working out yield potential, etc. Some of these examples are from horticulture now. But the thing that I want to show you is how this could possibly be used. And this is something that I've been working on for almost a decade now, and it will be commercialized next year by Ravensdown. And the real challenge here is trying to estimate soil fertility on our hill country. We have about 5.5 million hectares, I think, of hill country. It responds to fertilizer. We are actually highly reliant on superphosphate for this sector. So it is a problem that we need to resolve. It's something that it's real. It's not just a hypothetical argument. This is a real problem that we need to solve. So our hill country is highly variable. There's lots of different grass species, etc., that are in that environment. These are some of the farms that we use to calibrate a system that we developed to try and predict soil fertility in the hill country. So how did we do it? Or what was the plan? So I guess my part in it was that I was able to persuade Ravensdown that we could get enough information from a hyperspectral camera to be able to then predict what the soil fertility in the hill country is. Remember that we're only looking at the surface. We're not looking at the soil. We're only looking at the surface vegetation, and from that, what we're trying to do is work out what the soil fertility is below the vegetation. So the first part is that we've got to put the remote sensing together. Then we basically collate that information with other information, and we sit down at the kitchen table with the farmer to discuss what a fertilizer plan might look like. The other thing that we've had to do is modify aircraft. So I don't know how many of you have ever experienced top dressing and top dressing aircraft. It's a pretty hairy business. It's a difficult task for a pilot to do. They're flying close to the ground at high speed with a lot of weight behind them. So it's not an easy operation. And so what we've done is we've put a lot of computer control in the aircraft to make their life easier, to make it safer, and to make it able to function in the way that we want it to. What we're after is precision application. And the precision application will give us better productivity, better profitability. It will allow us to put the right amount of nutrient on in the right place. It will allow us to avoid certain areas of the farm, waterways, etc., that we want to avoid. So it's really putting a package together that I think can future-proof hill country farming. So I come from a farming background in Scotland. Hill country farming is kind of it is really in my DNA. Our family been involved in it for many years. It's something that I really believe passionately about, that we can improve the situation in New Zealand in terms of the profitability, etc., of hill country farming. So here's a nice example of a farm that we've used a lot, and I'll use this as an example to run through how a system might work. So you can see it's clearly not flat. It's quite challenging to get around. I think the farm's 2,600 hectares. It's difficult to move around, so we need to apply fertilizer by air. So what's the first step? The first step is we need to gather the hyperspectral information. So what we do is we fly the survey plane, got the flight path there, we take the information as I described earlier, and we make up a fertility plan. So this is an estimate of soil fertility. This is looking at Olsen P in the soil. You can probably detect from this farm it's actually 2 blocks. The left-hand part of the farm is a bit of a valley. You can see the higher level of fertility in that land. There's an area in the middle there that is actually still quite relatively low fertility that I want you to pay particular attention to. And there's another area to the right-hand side that is also low fertility, and just keep an eye on what needs to change. So every square meter of that farm has one of these profiles. So there'd be a profile here, and if I move maybe a meter, there's another profile a meter away, and that's what we use to create enough information to develop the plan, to develop the algorithms that we need, using machine learning, etc. Each map, this map here, I think it's made up from 26 million profiles. So there's probably, I think, 12 billion pieces of information to make that map. Okay, so there's our map that we've created. How did we do it? Well, the first thing we had to do was create algorithms that would allow us to get that hyperspectral information and turn it into real information. And in order to do that, we first need to calibrate what we're looking at. This is a guy, Reddy Poolanagari, who's worked with me for about a decade on this now. They do allow me out of the office occasionally to do something useful, like hold a board. So there's a lot of work in calibrating this type of imagery. Okay? So we use some other instruments, and we take a lot of samples to the lab. So what we've done is we've repeated the calibration process on a whole number of farms. On this farm, for example, there are 80 sites. This is the Wairarapa farm that I talked about. 80 sites, and we take 5 samples from each site. Everything's geolocated, it's repeatable, etc., etc. So 400 samples from each survey, and as many thousands of samples have gone in to create the algorithms for these maps. So looking at the optimum fertility, so Ravensdown have also got econometric models that they use to look at fertility. How can we optimize the fertility? So you see the area in the middle? You see how that's a blue? It actually should be at a higher level. So what we need to do is we need to give that area more fertilizer. And there are other areas of the farm where we can actually put less on. So typically an application might be around 350 to 400 kilograms a hectare. You can see there we're using superphosphate. We're also using sulfur super. But you can see the areas where we're actually putting more on. And those pink areas are areas where we're putting on significantly less, because we don't need to put the fertilizer level on that we've done previously, because the fertility is actually reasonable at the moment. So in these areas, what we've got to do is, you see it's a fairly complex plan, and there's no way that an aircraft would be able to deliver that without automation on the aircraft. So here's an example of what a flight plan would look like. So these lines are the tracks of the aircraft that have gone on to spread the fertilizer. So what we've done is we've changed the way that an aircraft works. So here's a day in the life of a top-dressing pilot. Pay attention to the screen in the middle. What he's going to do is he's going to lock onto a line. You'll see it turn green. That's when it's spreading. See how quickly we're going to avoid some water. You see how quickly it changes? In the blink of an eye, the hopper's shut. It's gone over the area we want to avoid, and then it's opened up again. Well, there's no way that a pilot would be able to do that. So other things that we can do is everything's got an electronic boundary. If we need to change, then we do that. It's all done automatically. So again, that's a key step, and it's all very well having a fancy hyperspectral camera, but we need to operationalize it. Unfortunately, the inset here isn't timed with the actual flight, but you can see how it opens and closes the shutter on the hopper on the plane. Now, there is a bit of dust there, and that looks as if it's hanging in the air. If you understand physics, the particles, the ballistics of the particles are actually quite predictable. And so we know exactly where it's going to be spread. We know when it needs to be shut off. We know when we can switch it on again. So again, there's been quite a bit of research has gone into that. Here's a photograph especially for Mavis. It's part of the Atihau Corporation farm, and they're also involved in this project. Now, you can see it's an absolutely beautiful environment. Nobody would deliberately trash that environment or try and farm it inappropriately. But I think the point is that we've got to give people better tools to farm it in a way for the future. How do we farm in a way that's going to be sustainable, that's going to be financially viable, rather than what has been done in the past? So, although I'm advancing in years, and I've been at this for about 40 years now, I feel at the moment that I'm really quite excited about the prospect for the future. I think if we can bring data science into our systems much more than we've done in the past, and get the scale and get these things right, then I think there's a huge potential in what we're doing. So I work at PlantTech. We're developing a lot of these types of things now for horticulture. Hope you can at least reflect on what that type of technology can do and what others might be available. Thank you.